Thanks for joining me. My name is Garrett Hamilton. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Reach, and I have folks on the security leadership side as well as leaders at valued resellers. We have Josh, Ray, and Joe. Now, I thought we could go ahead and introduce ourselves a little bit before we get the discussion started, maybe a little bit more on yourself and what you do at the company you support.
My name is Joshua Jones. I'm actually the vice president of Tevora. So Tevora is an organization that specializes in two different things. First is cybersecurity services. We have around 500 to 600 different types of cybersecurity services, as well as we resell technologies like Reach Security here. I personally live in Phoenix, Arizona, and have been in cybersecurity for about 21 years on both the manufacturing side as well as the reseller side.
My name is Raymond Winder. I am the Director of Information Security Engineering at Autodesk. I've been there for roughly 2 years, and I've been in the information security space for nearly 20 years now.
Hi everyone, my name is Joe Masud. I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity Architecture and Engineering at Aristocrat. I'm based out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I've been at Aristocrat for nearly 3 years, and I've been in the cybersecurity space for almost 20 years as well.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today and appreciate that. So we have, if you don't know a little bit more about Aristocrat, manufacturing, gaming, Autodesk, technology, AI, and of course, on the valued reseller side, partnership. So we have this dynamic where we have somebody that speaks to a lot of different security leaders and partners with them as they go on their security journey, as well as people that are contributing day-to-day to protecting the organizations. So one of the things that I always like to start with in having these conversations, especially since there's a diverse group of people, is what are the immediate kind of tactical trends that you're seeing? So for those viewing this, we are coming up on a new year, and there's always a definition of where is the industry going, but you get kind of lost in the strategic versus tactically what's so important. So, Josh, in your wheelhouse, you have the opportunity to speak to a lot of different organizations of varying sizes. What are some of maybe the key trends, 1, 2, or 3 key trends tactically that people are really focused on addressing in 2025 with their programs?
Yeah, so I feel like the question probably has more than 3 answers, but I would say probably top 3. We are a firm that specializes in regulatory compliance, so anything regulatory driven is definitely something that our constant conversations top of mind. There's a lot of new regulatory changes that have come out, like PCI 4.0, framework changes, NIST 2.0, et cetera. So I would definitely say that's top. Second, competing is probably more from a rationalization perspective. A lot of organizations are trying to get away from the whack-a-mole spend. Money was very fluid a few years ago. A lot of people, even for regulatory perspective, actually purchase technology to solve a problem versus how do we look at this as a platform play? How do we look at solving the problem, if you will, with either technology we have or bringing in technology to solve multiple problems? So there's a lot of kind of rationalization, modernization discussions that are happening. And then thirdly, I would say anything to do with data. Any type of data project, whether that's localized data, whether that's data in transit, whether that's tagging your data from a regulatory compliance perspective, and data in the cloud, so whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, if it has to do with data right now, it is a top project.
Now, Josh, I gave you 3, but you said there might be more. I'll give you one more. What would be one more that is top of mind right now on top of data and the other ones you mentioned?
Identity. Yeah.
And what does that look like?
I mean, all the way down to, surprisingly, there's a lot of companies rebuilding their entire identity program, so building from the ground up. And, and it's the same thing with data, actually. There's a lot of data rebuilds happening. But it's about identifying how are they managing it and how are they looking at it from a data governance perspective. And then as they're starting to look at it more from a governance perspective, they're starting to realize that they need to rebuild the entire program. So we're seeing from buying and purchasing tools to how are they maximizing the investments they've already made to how are they building the programs from the ground up that actually will meet regulatory requirements or governance requirements.
Ray, what are you seeing?
A lot of similar as well. My space, such as identity, and not only human identity, but also non-human identities. I believe Gartner is coining this as machine identities, as the NHIs now. Also in the space, data security as well. Heavy concentration there, especially as AI becomes more prevalent with customer data, internal data, and things like that. And then of course always adhering to regulatory compliance requirements. So the entire ecosystem from infrastructure security-wise to data security, identity, as well as exposure management.
Yeah, from our side, definitely resonates a lot with what I'm hearing from a data protection, identity and access management space, compliance, especially external compliance. All those are very key strategic priorities for us as well. The only ones that I'd probably add on top of that is product security, a strong focus on shifting left and helping improve the developer experience, creating efficiencies as well from reducing the cost of security by implementing that as early as possible in the development lifecycle. And our view on from a compliance perspective, we've also included the internal compliance as well. So our ability to ensure that we are meeting our controls and delivering on our control capabilities as well, and ensuring that we're doing the right things internally for our own sake, against our own measures, our own program, not just focusing external as well. So we've kind of bundled those two things together, call it continuous compliance from a strategic priority perspective.
Would it be fair to also maybe refer to that as an assurance? You guys are doing assurance internally against your technical controls?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that is typically not fun to highlight and talk about, but I do think it's important, is either standards or compliance. I heard it across the board. Both groups here from the Aristocrat and Autodesk have multiple factors of AI and things you're using, either but internal, but also as well as in the products that you sell. But we're also hearing a lot more boards being mindful of compliance, but also standards or things of that sort of maturity models. Some of the ones that we hear about are things like NIST CSF being a top of mind method of looking at maturity, as well as some of the regulatory items. So I'd be curious where you're seeing regulatory versus maturity come into play in your jobs. And I would maybe define these as you mentioned PCI 4.0. I would think of that as more of the regulatory component, and then maturity may be a NIST CSF or even a CMMC type of scoring model. So be curious of how you're seeing those converge. And Joe, we ended with you, so why don't we start with you and get your input there, given you have this mix of software and manufacturing that you guys tackle at Aristocrat.
Now, from a cyber program perspective, we use NIST CSF. And obviously, most recently, the shift to NIST CSF 2.0. We've been using that as our framework and ultimately measuring our program over the last couple of years. So this year with the new 2.0, it's been a new view against our program. It's helped improve and ultimately kind of change the dynamic of how we've been measuring progress and ultimately setting the stage of where we're going. And on the software side, we also use OWASP SAM, which is the software assurance maturity model, to help measure how we're doing from a development practices perspective as well. So we kind of use a combination of those two programs, but ultimately from a framework perspective of how we look at everything comprehensively, we use NIST.
Ray, you have a pretty complex organization. Many people don't know how old Autodesk is. You were doing things where Microsoft had software to do certain things like run businesses. So how does that come into play in the now as you're looking at an organization that's not just referred to as security, but trust, right? Your trust now inside of the business.
Yeah, so trust us, as Joe was kind of mentioning earlier, around not only adhering to regulatory controls, but our own internal standards as well, or assurance, as you were saying, Garrett. So are we meeting our own commitments, essentially, across the board, either it be if you're somebody in marketing or you're on the trust team. And that's how we measure that trust for internal. And then, of course, what we're trying to do with trust is gain our customers' trust as well through transparency, compassion. And as also Joe was saying with NIST CSF, that's something that we utilize as a benchmark, especially as it's gone through its transition to 2.0 from metrics around operations to more quantitative risk.
So, Josh, arguably the most data for last here, right? You do these at Tevora. You provide these services to be able to do these assessments, measure this maturity, assist in doing that. We picked on NIST CSF because we're hearing about it a lot, and it seems other folks are using it. But you sit at the inflection point, or really the meeting of both a requirement, regulatory, and also how do we measure the success of our program. So, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, what both of they said, 100%. I think I would say 9 out of 10 organizations are using that as a benchmark or a framework, right? So when you look at benchmark or frameworking, typically that's the cyber approach of, what does best in class look like? How do I measure myself against that? But reality is, and this is how we work with most of our customers. We look at it from a tip of the spear, tip of the pyramid, right? Is what's the regulatory requirement that you might actually have, right? How do we back that into the frameworks, whatever framework it might be? It might be NIST CSF, it might be MITRE, it might be whatever it is, depending if you're trying to go from an attack-based framework or if you're looking at more a cyber or a reactive-based framework. There's architectural frameworks, other things, depending on the company. Then we start looking at how does that reflect back into people and process, right? So what do you have in place? What's the process? What are internal people that are assigned to that? All the way down to, what do you have from a paperwork trail, documentation, stuff like that. So who does what in the case of what? And then lastly, how do we back this all into products? The reality is your regulatory requirements need to back into the product. Product needs to fit that and needs to fit through the framework itself, and then vice versa. So if you have PCI compliance and you're following this, or you're trying to go after an ISO framework or whatever it might be, and you're looking at certification or you're following it from a security perspective, what are the people, process, and programs you need in place in order to be able to follow that? And then make sure that the technologies feed that. Is it going to be CrowdStrike? Is it going to be reach security? Is it going to be whatever? But it needs to map forward and backwards in order for that to work for the organization. And again, that's both from regulatory and from a cybersecurity perspective. So, and that's how we have most of our conversations.
Yeah, people, process, technology. I think oftentimes, depending on the organization, they get really hunkered down in one of them being important. And so it brings me to the question for this group as we talk about measuring our security programs, maturity, doing it against some standard or also regulatory. How are you doing it today, and how would you like to see it done in the future, right? How much of it is, I often hear about spreadsheets and manual interactions and one-time efforts, what does it look like today for at least your peers, and if you can describe a little your process and how are you trying to make that more efficient? Because it looks like all of you, including the customer you speak to, are maturing the way in which you represent your security program, the standards you adhere to, as well as what the policymakers are asking for. So Raymond, let's start with you.
The first thing that comes to mind is continuous compliance or continuous improvements. Essentially, putting together a life cycle model of your program. What does it look like from beginning to end? But it doesn't end there, as we all know here. Security is a journey, not a race. Or some people say it's a marathon, but I think it's more of a journey that's never ending, just like life. And also making continuous improvements. So what does that mean for us security practitioners? Is always evolving, looking at the threats that are coming down the pipe and how we can improve our own internal processes as well as our commitments across our organization.
And Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say on a practical perspective, I think about when I first joined Aristocrat and really trying to seek understanding of what does the implementation of our security program look like? What are we doing well? Where are there opportunities, and where we are in our journey for cybersecurity, and to ultimately help set the stage of where we should go and where do we have these kind of things that obviously could be better. That was a lot of one-time efforts, a lot of one-time work like you described, and tremendous amount of work to go seek that level of understanding, because while, especially as new to the company, trying to understand the business as much as possible and really what the infrastructure and the architectures look like, understanding how controls are being used and how we're using those controls across the board, while also trying to understand what the best practices are, it's a tremendous amount of challenge, and things are changing and evolving on a daily basis. I could proudly say that we've had significant improvements on a technology perspective by introducing platforms like Reach that help automate these kinds of capabilities and ultimately do this work for us. So what I was doing with significant amount of engineering efforts has now been simplified because the technology is helping me understand how we're doing against not just from our control implementations, but also from what we're doing against our own threat profile and what's actually happening across the environment in real time versus a one-time project that we had to run over the course of a couple of months.
Did you find that because you ran that project once, the business was now seeking that insight on a regular cadence? Or is it something that once you realized kind of, oh wow, I can't stop, I have to continue going, how much of it was the business driving this versus you in terms of being able to communicate how the program's going?
I would say it was a combination of both. I'd say at the start, the justification of why we're launching this project and why we're doing it, tremendous amount of business involvement, and ultimately evangelizing why we're doing things and the output of those projects, tremendous amount of support from the business to do that. But in the back of my mind, knowing that configuration drift is going to continue to happen, new features are going to get released, things are going to change over time. I know I'm going to need to run the project again. I know that things are not permanent and things are going to change. Not only will new controls get implemented, but new threats are going to evolve, new features. AI was not really a concern a couple of years ago. Now it's a tremendous concern. Understanding how I can maximize on my security tools. It's an evolving landscape, and like Ray said, a journey that we need to continuously be on. One-time efforts don't really scale. And going back to the business and talking about how we're going to run the same project over and over again starts to sound very much like BAU. And when I think about the level of effort that it takes to do that, it's not really balanced from that perspective. I need to think about how to optimize and automate those kinds of activities, and Reach does help with that.
So closing thoughts on that, people, process, technology, cobbling together spreadsheets, continuous nature of this. What do you think, Josh?
I think it all comes down to measuring success and measuring investment, right? And I think you guys spot on, right? And I'd oversimplify it to, and again, as a consultant, of how are you measuring your investments? How are you measuring your success, right? How are you continuing to show to your board or to your executives that, hey, these investments I've made are sound, right? And how am I continuing to say on a monthly basis that we're getting the most out of this investment? And again, you had mentioned Reach Security, and that's obviously why we're here a little bit and talking about it, but I think it does a really good job of doing exactly that. What am I getting out of the investments I've made? Where am I misconfigured? How am I leveraging this, and how can I better leverage it? And or how am I over-provisioned or under-provisioned based on the business outcome I'm trying to portray or trying to get to, if you will, in order to invest in these technologies? And
you've communicated to me in the past, it's been a natural conversation for you as a consultant, and a partner to your customers.
Yep.
Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's a natural conversation to be able to have?
I'd say twofold. One is I think a lot of executives and not even executives, right? A lot of leaders of different BUs and business units, especially like engineering groups, don't have a really sound way to prove that they're actually maximizing what they invested in, right? A lot of times what happens is they're looking at solving actually a problem or a widget, or there's a regulatory reason that they need to, what I typically call like whack-a-mole, solving problems, right? And they've thrown tools at solving these problems. And I've ran into a lot recently where there's $500,000 investments. They're using it for a very small sliver, 20, 30% of the investment they've actually made. And or very, very good sales reps at vendors that have actually oversold by SKUs on technologies that are not even deployed. And when you start to really peel back the onion, you say, it's practitioners looking at their partners, if you will, or their vendors, and saying like, hey, are we getting everything we want? And that's why quarterly business reviews exist and things like that. But they're a little bit at the mercy of, are they solving their business problem? And is my vendor telling me the truth that I'm actually using it the way it needs to be used, right? A lot of times those two are very conflicting, and you got to trust your partners that they're telling you everything that you are or are not doing that the tool could do, right? So having third-party views, and this is even from a consultant perspective, to come in and say, well, are you, and seeing it in thousands of companies, are you using it for all 15 of these things? And I've seen it time and time again where they're like, well, we're only under the impression that it does these 3 or 4 things. And it's like, well, reality is you haven't turned on any of these functionalities, and oh, by the way, your Okta environment could do A, B, and C. And I feel like that, like a Reach technology can come in and automate that visibility, right? To almost create a checks and balance or a governance model. And that's why even like when we first started talking, you were saying, hey, this is kind of like a tools rationalization. It is, but it's so much more. It's more of a tools governance, right? It actually creates the ability to say, am I maximizing my investment to almost down to what percentage? Is it configured appropriately? Am I paying too much, too little? And really get that kind of bird's eye view of, am I maximizing my investments that I've currently made? And or do I need to make some changes? And or can I trust my partners per se, right? Of some of these investments I've made. So I look at it as more of a governance over top of the tools itself.
So Josh, to you, what are you seeing as kind of the big things coming out, the big things that you're doing for your customers consultatively?
I would say, in addition to a lot of things we talked about, right, from a programmatic perspective, the two big initiatives that we're leaning heavily into next year are anything to do with AI, right, and really from a risk factor. So how is risk being introduced to organizations through AI, right? So how does it have outside access? Are you looking at it through a risk lens, and how can you be communicating that back to your board, right? So, and more of a helping give visibility, but also helping give the transparency back to the board in a language in which they'll understand, which is risk. Secondly, I would say it's CMMC. As a lot of people know, CMMC, the new requirements actually just were released, and there's tens of thousands of organizations out there that are going to need to be compliant. We are a 3PAO company, and so we're focused a lot, I would say we're going to be focused a lot on this coming year on helping organizations become compliant with CMMC.
Well, I'm sure the narrative around AI resonates with the practitioners in the room, and both the how to use it to your own benefit as well as protecting the end users, and especially the companies you work at. So I'd like to wrap up with that and just say thank you all for attending, sharing your insights, sharing what your priorities are, and looking forward to the next time we all get together and have a conversation about what maybe 26 will look like. Thank you.
Thank you.